How did a small group of knights become one of the most powerful orders in history? The Rise of the Knights Templar, Birth of a Holy Order, Part 1, From Desert Guards to the Guardians of Christendom. The walls of Jerusalem gleamed like a promise in the blazing heat of July 1099. Stone after stone, the crusading army of Godfrey of Bouillon had breached them, had stormed through them, had conquered them in the name of Christ and Christendom. The streets below the walls ran red with blood, not just the blood of soldiers, but of civilians, of merchants, of anyone unfortunate enough to have been caught between the Christian hunger for the holy city and the Muslim determination to defend it. When the dust finally settled and the screams had faded into an exhausted silence, a profound truth had become undeniably clear. Jerusalem, the most sacred place in Christendom, had been liberated deemed from the hands of the infidels. The pilgrims began arriving almost immediately. They came in trickles at first, then in streams, then in floods. From across Christian Europe they journeyed, from France and England, from Germany and Spain, from Italy and the far reaches of Scandinavia. They came on foot and on horseback, in organized groups and as solitary seekers of redemption. They carried nothing but faith and hope and an almost unbearable devotion to the place where their God had walked, suffered, and been reborn. But the journey was a nightmare beyond comprehension. The road from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem was not a gentle pilgrimage through peaceful lands. It was a gauntlet of death, a corridor of terror that seemed deliberately designed to test the faith of even the most devout Christian. Bandits infested the route, desperate men expelled soldiers from failed crusades, Bedouin raiders who understood perfectly that a pilgrim laden with silver and gold was an opportunity too precious to ignore. These murderers did not discriminate. They killed the old and the young, the women and the children, with the methodical efficiency of men for whom human life had lost all meaning. The most horrifying accounts came from those rare survivors who managed to reach Jerusalem against all odds. They spoke of pilgrims left to rot in the sun, of bodies so decomposed they could not be identified, of graves dug by the hundreds along the pilgrim road, unmarked, unsanctified, forgotten. They spoke of families separated forever, of children torn from parents' arms and sold into slavery, of women subjected to horrors that polite society refused to name aloud, and still the pilgrims came. Because the pull of Jerusalem, the gravity of that holy place, was stronger than fear, stronger than reason, stronger than the most vivid nightmare. It was this crisis, this steady, relentless stream of Christian martyrs dying on a road that should have been sacred, that would give birth to an idea so revolutionary, so perfectly suited to its moment, that it would change the course of medieval history. In the year 1119, nearly 20 years after the conquest of Jerusalem, a French knight approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposition. The knight's name was Hugues de Payens, and he was not a man of great renown. He was not a famous warrior, not a decorated commander, not a nobleman of exceptional wealth or power. He was simply a knight from the Champagne region of France, a man of ordinary appearance and ordinary station, with an extraordinary idea. Hugues de Payens had witnessed the pilgrims. He had seen them arrive in Jerusalem broken and traumatized, had seen the terror in their eyes as they recounted the horrors of the journey. And he had conceived of a solution so elegant in its simplicity that it seems almost obvious in retrospect. What if, he asked King Baldwin, there existed a small group of knights, not a large army, not a grand military force, but a dedicated band of warriors who took sacred vows to protect these pilgrims? What if these knights bound themselves together through religious oaths, through monastic discipline, through absolute commitment to their mission? What if they lived lives of poverty and chastity, renouncing the comforts and pleasures that distracted ordinary warriors? Would this not create a force of extraordinary dedication and moral clarity? King Baldwin II listened carefully. The king was a practical man, and Hugues de Payens was offering him something he desperately needed, a solution to a problem that was bleeding his kingdom. Pilgrims were dying. The reputation of the Crusader kingdoms was suffering. The church was growing frustrated with the failures to protect those who journeyed to the holiest sites in Christendom. Baldwin agreed. By January 1120, at the Council of Nablus, the king had formally approved Hugues de Payens' proposal. More than that, he granted the new order something precious: headquarters. The king gave them a wing of his royal palace, a location that would become legendary in the centuries to come, a building constructed upon the very Temple Mount, the sacred ground where the great Temple of Solomon had once stood, where Islamic conquerors had built their own holy mosque, where now Christian knights would take their vows. The order received a name that reflected its condition: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History would know them more simply as the Knights Templar. When Hugues de Payens gathered his first followers in those early days, there were only 9 of them. 9 men living in poverty in a commandeered building with almost no resources beyond what they could beg from sympathetic nobles. Their seal, the image that would identify them to Christendom, depicted 2 knights riding upon a single horse. It was a deliberate statement of poverty, a visual reminder that these men owned nothing, that their wealth existed only in their virtue. For nearly a decade, the Templars remained largely unknown. They performed their duty with quiet dedication, protecting individual pilgrims on the roads, escorting small groups, building their reputation through small acts of courage and consistent reliability. They were not famous. They were not celebrated. They were simply men who did a job that others would not do, sustained by vows that bound them more tightly than any contract could bind ordinary soldiers. But in the year 1126, something happened that would change everything. Count Hugh of Champagne, a powerful French nobleman, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He came to Jerusalem to pray, to perform acts of penance, to seek absolution from the church for his sins. While he was there, he came into contact with Hugues de Payens and the small band of knights that had gathered around him. Something about their dedication moved him profoundly, and so the Count did what wealthy medieval nobles did when something moved them. He gave a donation, but he gave something far more valuable than gold or silver. He gave a family connection. André de Montbard, a member of Count Hugh's entourage, asked permission to join the Templars. André was not a man without options. He came from a noble family with connections and resources, but he chose to embrace poverty and vows. And when André joined the Templars, he brought with him something that would prove invaluable. He brought relatives. Among those relatives was a man named Bernard of Clairvaux, who would become perhaps the most influential churchman of the 12th century. Bernard was not merely a monk. He was a reformer, a visionary, a man whose words carried the weight of spiritual authority across all of Christendom. When Bernard looked at the Templars through the lens of his kinship with André de Montbard, he saw not merely a military order, but something revolutionary, a fusion of 2 ideals that had been kept separate since the founding of Christianity itself: the ideal of the contemplative monk and the ideal of the warrior. It was this fusion, this marriage of prayer and sword, that would capture Bernard's imagination. By the late 1120s, Bernard and Hugues de Payens had begun to correspond. They had begun to discuss the theological possibility of what the Templars represented: a knight who could be as devoted to prayer as any Cistercian monk, and a monk who could be as fearless in battle as any secular warrior. It was a paradox, but a paradox that Bernard began to believe was not merely theologically sound, but theologically necessary. And so Bernard did something remarkable. He set out across Europe with Hugues de Payens, preaching the message of the Templars to kings and nobles and bishops. Everywhere they went, they found a receptive audience. The concept of holy warriors defending Christian pilgrims struck a chord in the medieval imagination. Nobles who had no way to achieve spiritual redemption through military service in distant lands suddenly saw an opportunity. They could support these warriors through donations, and in supporting them, they could purchase a form of spiritual credit, a way of participating in the Grand Crusade to preserve Christendom's access to its holiest sites. The donations began immediately. Land was given, castles were gifted, entire villages were placed under the control of the Templar Order. Young men, the sons of noble houses, men with titles and prospects and futures, began to ask if they could join this new brotherhood. The Templars, who had begun as 9 impoverished knights with no resources beyond their vows, were being transformed by the force of Bernard's advocacy and the generosity of European Christendom. Then came the moment that would cement their official status and transform them from a promising experiment into a recognized institution of the Church. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, church leaders from across Christendom gathered to discuss matters of faith and practice. Among those present was Pope Honorius II, represented by papal legates, along with cardinals, archbishops, and bishops. It was a solemn assembly, full of the weight of ecclesiastical authority. Bernard of Clairvaux rose to speak. What he said would echo across the centuries. He spoke of the necessity of the Templars, of their virtuous poverty, of their dedication to a cause that transcended ordinary military service. He spoke of them not as soldiers, but as a new kind of Christian, a warrior monk who embodied the highest ideals of both traditions. A Templar knight is truly a fearless knight, Bernard proclaimed, and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by the armor of steel. He is thus doubly armed, and need fear neither demons nor men. The council voted. The decision was unanimous. The Knights Templar were officially approved by the Church. More than that, they were given something of extraordinary value, a formal rule, 72 detailed clauses written in Latin that would govern every aspect of their lives, from what they could eat to how many horses they could own, to what prayers they must recite at designated hours of the day. But the approval from the Council of Troyes was merely the beginning. In the years that followed, the Templars received gift after gift of ecclesiastical privilege. In 1135, at the Council of Pisa, Pope Innocent II made a personal donation to the order, a symbolic statement that the papacy itself stood behind them. Then, in 1139, came the decree that would truly set the Templars apart from every other institution in medieval Christendom. Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull called Omni Datum Optimum. This document exempted the Templars from obedience to local laws. They would not pay tithes to local bishops. They would not be subject to local courts. They could pass freely through all borders without paying customs duties. They answered to no authority on earth except the Pope himself. The effect was explosive. Wealth poured into the Templar order from every direction. Noble families gave them estates, castles, entire villages. Merchant families donated warehouses and trading rights. Bishops and abbots, seeking to curry papal favor, granted them lands and privileges. Young men of good families sought admission into the order, bringing with them inheritances and titles and connections. The Templars, who had begun as 9 impoverished knights guarding pilgrim roads, were now becoming something unprecedented. A multinational institution with properties across the entire width and breadth of Christendom. But they were not merely becoming wealthy. They were also becoming the most fearsome military force in the world. When the Second Crusade was called in 1147, led by King Louis VII of France, the Templars were there. Hundreds of them, heavily armored, mounted on war horses, organized and disciplined in a way that no feudal levy could match. They fought at the front of the Crusader army. They provided security through dangerous passages. They served as shock troops, charging into enemy lines ahead of the main force, breaking formations, creating chaos. At a meeting in Paris on April 27, 1147, Pope Eugenius III granted the Templars permission to wear a distinctive symbol, a red cross on their white mantles. This simple image, a white cloak with a red cross, would become one of the most recognizable and feared symbols in medieval warfare. When pilgrims saw Templar knights riding toward them on the pilgrim roads, they knew they would reach Jerusalem alive, and when Muslim commanders saw that red cross approaching across the desert, they knew they faced warriors who would never surrender, who would never flee, who would fight to the death if necessary, because they had taken vows. By the 1170s and 1180s, the Templars had evolved from protectors of pilgrims into the elite military force of the Crusader kingdoms. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, some 500 Templar knights, fighting under their commanders and displaying their distinctive red cross, helped a combined force of a few thousand Christian warriors to defeat an army of more than 26,000 soldiers under the command of Saladin, the greatest Muslim warrior of the age. It was a stunning victory, the kind of victory that reinforced legends, that seemed to prove that the Templars were invincible, that they were the earthly instrument of God's will. But while the Templars were becoming legendary as warriors, something equally important was happening behind the scenes, something far less visible but ultimately far more powerful. The Templars were becoming bankers. It began simply enough. A pilgrim journeying to the Holy Land faced a terrible dilemma. How could he carry his wealth across dangerous lands without being murdered for it? The Templars, with their network of commanderies stretching across Europe and into the Levant, recognized an opportunity. A pilgrim could deposit his valuables with the Templars in Europe, receive a document indicating the value of his deposit, and then present that document to a Templar house in the Holy Land to claim an equivalent amount of wealth. It was a simple arrangement. It was also revolutionary. The Templars had invented, centuries before modern banking, a system that essentially created money from trust. The documents themselves became valuable. Kings and nobles began depositing their treasures with the Templars. Lords began using Templar houses as banks, storing their wealth in Templar vaults, borrowing money from Templar treasurers. By the late 12th century, the Templars controlled a vast financial network. They owned vineyards and mills and farmland. They were involved in international trade. They issued credit. They negotiated loans. They managed the finances of kingdoms. The King of England owed them money. The King of France owed them money. Major nobles across Europe owed them money. The Templars had become so financially powerful that they were, in effect, the bankers of Christendom. And then came the moment that would plant the seeds of everything to follow. In 1291, the last great Crusader fortress in the Holy Land, the port city of Acre, fell to Muslim forces. The Templars, who had garrisoned the city, fought to the last, but despite their courage and their discipline, they could not hold against overwhelming numbers. The city fell, thousands of Templars died defending it. The survivors retreated to the island of Cyprus, and the last permanent Christian stronghold in the Holy Land was lost. For the first time, the Templars had to confront an uncomfortable question. What was their purpose now? For nearly 2 centuries, the answer had been clear. The Templars existed to protect Christian pilgrims on the roads to the Holy Land. They existed to garrison the fortresses that defended the Crusader kingdoms. They existed to fight the Muslim enemy and to preserve Christian access to the holy sites. But now, in the final years of the 13th century, with the Crusader states gone and the pilgrimage roads closed, that purpose had become obsolete. The Templars still existed. They still commanded vast wealth. They still controlled territories and properties across Europe. They still answered to no authority except the Pope. But they no longer had a clear reason to exist. They had become, in essence, an institution without a purpose, a rich, powerful, autonomous institution that no longer served an obvious function. In the royal palaces of Europe, practical men began to ask uncomfortable questions. One such man sat in Paris in the early years of the 14th century. His name was Philip IV, and he was the King of France. He was known as Philip the Fair, not because he was just, but because he was beautiful to look upon. His face was handsome, his bearing was regal, his manner was courtly. But beneath the attractive exterior lay a mind of cold calculation and ruthless ambition. Philip was deeply in debt. His wars against England had been expensive. His political schemes had required vast amounts of gold, and much of that gold he owed to the Knights Templar. The Templars were his creditors, and that fact gave them a leverage over him that no king could tolerate. Philip began to think about solutions. He thought about the vast Templar wealth that lay spread across his kingdom like a treasure waiting to be seized. He thought about an institution that was so independent that it answered to no one but the Pope, and a Pope who lived in Avignon, far away, weakened by political pressures and increasingly reliant on French support. And Philip began to imagine what might happen if the Templars were no longer an independent institution. What if their wealth could be seized? What if their lands could be confiscated? What if a king could free himself from his debts by destroying those to whom he owed money? These were dangerous thoughts. They were also, as it would turn out, inevitable thoughts. Because the Templars, in the moment of their greatest triumph, had sown the seeds of their own destruction. They had become too powerful. They had accumulated too much wealth. They answered to no one but the Pope, and they had lost the purpose that had justified their existence. In a world of practical politics and careful calculations of power, the Templars had become an anomaly, an institution that could not be controlled by any king, that could not be taxed or regulated. Philip of France would prove more than equal to the challenge of discovering those means. For now, it is enough to know that in the year 1307, when the autumn leaves began to fall over the cities of France, everything was about to change. A king with a terrible vision was about to set events in motion that would shake Christendom to its foundations and transform a legendary order of holy warriors into history's most famous victims. The story of the Knights Templar, their rise from humble beginnings to unimaginable power, and their fall from invincibility to annihilation, was entering its final chapter, and in the shadows, a King Philip the Fair was beginning to smile.
If you enjoyed today's return to the Middle Ages, I'd be truly grateful for your like. It's the best way to let me know that these stories are worth making. I'm already preparing the next chapter for you, so if you don't want to miss it, consider subscribing. I'll see you next week.